40K Fireside podcast, where we discuss everything to do with competitive Warhammer 40K with your hosts Vik VJ and David Gaylord. Hello everyone, welcome back to 40K Fireside. This is Vik here, and this is a public video I'm doing where I'm going to be talking a little bit about the new Thousand Suns Codex. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, oh, Vik is being so quiet, he's not talking. I had a really interesting journey through learning this new Thousand Suns Codex. For people who don't know, Thousand Suns has been something that I've been playing as quite a lot over the last 2 or 3 years, through 9th edition and then through 2 WTCs. The first WTC, the list with rubrics and characters attached, was actually something that I felt I really innovated at the time. So to see that particular archetype become something that went through kind of 2 years, it was really cool. So it's awesome for me to be back on Thousand Suns and playing around with the new codex. But there are a lot of things which don't translate too well across from the index over to the codex. There's a lot of rules which have been toned down or changed in nature, and there have been other rules which have been improved or completely changed in nature. So when I first started using the codex, I found it a real challenge to work out what actually works. How is this dealing with melee pressure? How does this have enough stuff, enough durability in order to survive shooting matchups? Is it losing on both ends? It can't really deal against loads of shooting. It can't really deal with loads of melee. But then over time, as I've kind of played more and more games, tweaked my lists again and again, I finally started to find something that clicked a little bit. And then when I went back and reflected on it, I realized it wasn't really the list. It was really the strategies that improved my success with Thousand Suns. Now, I did a video similar to this, which was 5 ways to get more success out of your Eldari army. And people engaged with that so well. So I want to do a similar thing with Thousand Suns here and try and give everyone who's listening a few strategies. So I put 3 strategies here, but really it's kind of like 9 strategies because each point breaks down into other points. On how to improve your success with Thousand Suns based on the learning and the experiences I've had with the army. Now, I am taking Thousand Suns to a super major next weekend, which is the 420-person Bristol Super Major, which is a huge event. And this is the first week Thousand Suns is going to be legal. So I'm really, really lucky that I have such a big event there. I'm going to do a deep dive of my list on the members side, which is going to release at the same time as this episode. So if that's something you're interested in and you want to know like more about the tiny little details of list building and list building theory for Thousand Suns, that's a Grand Coven list. If you want to see that, make sure you do join as a member at the Katachan level. That'll give you access to all the members only videos. But beyond that, our Eldari channel has done such an amazing thing where it's grown into, in my opinion, probably the best resource for Eldari knowledge and innovation that you can find in 40K. So if you do want to get involved with the Thousand Suns Discord, make sure you join at the Phoenix Lord level and join us there. We have loads of discussion going on all the time. But the Thousand Suns side of things, I would love it if that became like the Eldari, where we're really, the best place to go for competitive, innovative advice. But let's kind of focus on this video. Now, Thousand Suns are a super interesting army, but they are really, really fiddly to play. For opponents of this army, you might look at it and think, what do you mean they're so fiddly to play? They do so much damage, they do all this stuff. The Mutilate Vortex beasts are so tanky. But actually, in reality, the core damage dealing part of this army is so incredibly fragile, which is the Rubric Marines, is very expensive as well, that it's really tricky to find your momentum and flow to be able to get through to the end of the game. And more importantly than that, the actual mechanics, even though they've been toned down in complexity and resource management, are really difficult to use in an optimal way. They're very easy to use, but they're very difficult to use in an optimal way. So Let's hone down on that first. So let's start off by looking at the army rule and how we can get the most out of it, because the army rule is actually incredibly complicated. It's not a simple rule where it's like, here you go, you can have a reroll to hit and wound, you get advance and charge and fall back and charge. There's actually a lot of little nuances to the wording all the way through. So the first thing is that in order to use the army rule, which is called the Cabal of Sorcerers, you need to pick one of your psychic models, and then you choose to attempt to manifest a psychic power. Now, if you fail to manifest that psychic power by not meeting the requirements of it, you can then try and use another psychic to cast the same spell. There's 4 different spells here, and when you're actually trying to cast the spells, they'll have a different psychic test requirement, a warp charge value. The 4 different spells, I've listed them on this right hand side. They have a base casting value, which in this case is 5, 6, 7, 9, going in ascending order. And then they also have an improved version where if you do cast it on a 10, 11, or 12, you'll be able to get more of a benefit, a more powerful version of that spell cast. Now, what's interesting is that the base way of casting the spell is to roll 2d6. You then look at the 2 dice and you decide if you want to channel the warp. At this point, you take on a little bit of risk, because if there's any doubles or triples in your rolls, you take D3 mortal wounds on the unit. Very important, it's on the unit. So if you have a solo character or Magnus, they're going to take it on themselves. But if you have any character attached to a rubric squad, you're going to be able to take it on the rubric squad instead. If your model dies, then the spell is not manifested. Yeah, if that model's not destroyed, yeah, perfect. And then the charge ability, the channel the warp, when you roll that, you add the extra d6, and at that point you can get a few other buffs. So you can get the Mutilate Vortex Beast kicking in at that point. Now, this is a super interesting mechanic, especially the ability to roll, to try and cast it with another psychic. So, with all of this there, we can start to create strategies on how we're going to maximize our kind of reliability of getting what we want as an outcome out of the game. So, if you go to David's video, which he did recently, he did do a lot of mathematics on this particular rule, and he came up with some good percentages, things to expect from it as well. But I want to try and change the numbers into words and then create a strategy that we can apply on the board from that. So if we have a little look at the values here, essentially how I'd like to think about it is we're trying to cast on 3d6, because a lot of the time that is what we're going to go for. If we hit what we want on a 2d6, great. But let's imagine we're casting on 3d6 here. Now, the spells that are written on here, just for people to be aware, Destiny's Ruin is if you cast it at base level, you pick an enemy unit, reroll ones to hit. If you cast it at the super level, it's reroll all hits. Temporal Surge, you move a unit d6 inches. If you roll 10, you move 6 inches. Doombolt is d3 mortal wounds or d3 plus 3 mortal wounds. Twist of Fate is -1 AP or -2 AP on the super version. All of them are cast at the start of the shooting phase, and you do them in sequential order. Which is super cool. It's so neat and clean. There are a few advantages and disadvantages here. So the previous rule, you could kind of plan out your turn, both at list building and based on what you have on the board, and you predictably get outcomes from it. This army rule has an unpredictability to it, because even if you're attempting to cast on a 5, you could just fail to cast that on 3d6. So there's a little bit more unpredictability, but your resource management is easier because you don't have to count up how many Cabal points you have. You just need 4 Psychers to attempt to cast spells. The more Psychers you have, the more reliability you can get into your army. I think it's a very clean update to the army rule. Now, if we have a little look, these are the ways that we can manipulate this particular army rule. Araman and Magnus get bonuses to casting. The Mutilate Vortex Beast gives you a bonus to channeling the warp. In total, if you had Magnus with a Mutilate nearby, you can get +3 to cast here. The Grand Coven detachment, which is the index kind of detachment in the codex, has a stratagem where you can reroll all 3 of the dice. And then it's also worth noting your final modifier is if you attempt to cast a spell which you failed to cast. So let's have a little look at percentages. Now, the exact numbers don't really matter. What we want to do is translate this into numbers. So on 3d6, you are pretty much always going to get off Destiny's Ruin, the reroll hits. you're always going to get off Temporal Surge. You have a great chance to get D3 Mortal Wounds on Doombolt. Twist of Fate becomes a bit unpredictable. You're dipping below that 74%. If you want to get the super version of Twist of Fate, it's really not happening on 3d6. 28% is pretty low. Half the time you're going to get Doombolt on a super version, and half the time you're going to cast up your other spells at the higher level. Now, it's worth noting 3 of these spells affect the enemy's unit, and 1 of the spells affects your own unit. But the spell which affects your own unit, and that's Temporal Surge, is so critically important because there's a massive difference when you're trying to activate your damage output on a unit from moving d6 inches and moving a flat 6 inches. So that's really the number we want to be looking at, and we want to be looking at the percentages on Temporal Surge, and that will guide us on our strategy of what we're going to do. So takeaways from this is it's really unpredictable to cast the buffed versions with the buffed versions of the spells if you yourself are not buffed, but it's pretty predictable to cast just the base level of the spells on 3d6, even if you don't have any support. But if we start to add a little bit of support, so we've got the Mutilate Vortex Beast around you, you start getting up to the 50% mark. There's a big improvement in Twist of Fate by just getting +1. There's a tiny improvement in Doombolt, and then Temporal Surge and the reroll hits are still a little fiddly. So all of these basically are very unpredictable for you to try and cast the buffed versions even with a +1. If we then try and do it with a reroll, this is where it becomes very interesting. So if we're casting with +2 to cast, or casting with +1 and the Coven reroll, suddenly our predictability becomes huge, and the number to look at is the Temporal Surge number. Everything else is perfectly fine if you don't hit it. So Temporal Surge being at 85% when you're casting with +1 and you have the option of a reroll is absolutely fantastic, and that is what we really need here. Now, there's still a 15% chance of failure, and you have to consider, is that your lose condition here? Do I need to create more fail safes? Do I need to be casting with +2 or +3 to cast with a Coven reroll to make sure Temporal Surge always goes off? And what are the cost implications of doing that? So let's kind of create a little bit of a strategy here, focusing purely on Temporal Surge. So the final manipulator that we can do is trying to cast with another Psyker if we fail our spell. We can only do that if we fail to cast it on the initial 2d6. So if we roll a 3, a 4, or 5 on our first 2d6, or 2. And there's a 17% chance of us failing on the first 2d6. And at that point, I would probably recommend that it's better to give up on attempting to cast the spell and just try and cast it with another Psyker, which will overall give you a little bit of a success increase. Now, if you combine that with casting with +1 or +2 or +1 and the Coven reroll, you can get into very, very high levels of predictability for being able to hit the 6-inch move with Temporal Surge. I like that as a strategy, and I think the way we want to do this is, if you're actually inside of the game, you want to try and create a failsafe just on your kind of one key spell that has to go off. Let's say, for example, there's only one other situation I think which is absolutely critical. So Temporal Surge is the main one. So Temporal Surge, if it fails, you can just automatically lose the game because you lose a huge amount of momentum. Your army is very fragile. So I think it's very important that you make sure you're casting it with at least a +1 to cast. Ideally, if you're in the Coven detachment, you can kind of use the reroll stratagem. And you want to have multiple Psykers available to be able to cast a spell. I like to set up at least one other Psyker here. And then the other situation is where if you're trying to cast Doombolt and you need to get 4 mortal wounds through, I think you can set up the same situation here if it's absolutely critical for you to do that for the sequencing of the rest of your turn. But there's nothing as critical as casting Temporal Surge for a 6-inch on your kind of momentum turns, which tend to be in the early game. Other takeaways are that actually casting with the base levels is pretty predictable, even if you don't have any buffs. The Grand Coven reroll has a massive improvement on the overall percentage chances of getting the buffed versions of the spells. So Grand Coven, I love Grand Coven, so I'm a big fan of that. And then finally, no matter what you do, Twist of Fate and Doombolt are a little bit unreliable. So I would just keep in mind And when you're doing your planning and you're thinking, okay, am I going to kill this? Am I going to kill that? Just kind of assume that you are not hitting the D3 plus 3 mortal wounds, and just assume that you're not getting the -2 AP, and then you'll feel much happier with yourself. Perfect. All right, let's move on to number 2, which is trying to really squeeze out all the damage from this army. Now, Thousand Suns are really interesting because you'll look at it and you'll be like, okay, you can shoot a few things with a Rubric squad, but when is that actually doing so much damage? I remember people analyzing these lists and thinking it's really not going to do anything here, these armies. But when you actually start shooting a single Rubric squad and you do squeeze out every last bit of damage that you can do, you'll find that you actually have quite high overall output from the units. And it's changed a little bit in terms of strategy in the codex compared to the index. So let's first of all start by looking at mortal wound output, because I think doing mortal wounds is probably one of the best ways the Thousand Suns operate to get a really surprising amount of consistent damage through. The one change which I absolutely love in the codex is that all of the psychic characters have got grenades. Grenades is so useful to be able to throw in an extra 2 to 4 mortal wounds on an enemy unit. If you then add that up to all the other ways, so we have a few very reliable ways of doing it. Our psychic attacks, some of them have the dev wound characteristic, but in Grand Coven, you can activate it with a stratagem or just with your detachment rule. The Soul Reaper cannon got a phenomenal glow up at AP2 ignore cover. It's absolutely fantastic, but that also does some dev wounds for you. I like taking the combi weapon on the Rhino, and the Rhino is a really useful source of tank shocking. I'm a big fan of the Rhino in general in Thousand Suns Codex, so adding a tank shock in, suddenly you can do loads of mortal wounds, tag up your opponent, etc. And the Mutilith Vortex Beast is priced to absolutely move somehow still, and has a really handy mortal wound aura. So you can get a lot of consistency from these sources, but it's very important when you're doing your planning, both from a list building perspective and planning out your turns output. Never feel locked out like, oh, there's no way I'm going to kill this. Because actually, if you add up all your mortal wounds, you'll find that you do a really high amount of damage. Let's take an example here where we use a Rubric squad and we attach it with either an Infernal Master or a Sorcerer. This is the premium output combination in this codex. Choosing one of these two characters, and both of them are absolutely phenomenal. There's very little in it. You probably end up taking combinations of both of these characters. And what you'll find is if you look at their profiles, you look at it and be like, yeah, this is phenomenal anti-infantry profiles, really good at killing chaff, etc. But actually, if you go in, set up your one Rubric squads as your trade piece, goes forward, temporal surges into place, and then you look at something a little tanky. Let's take an Armiger here, a Warglaive, and then we do a Doombolt. We maybe throw a -2 AP onto this unit. And then we throw our grenades before we then attack with the psychic attacks. The psychic attacks could have dev wounds or +1 to wound from Grand Coven. And then you throw the Soul Reaper cannon as well. Now, what's surprising is that really easily kills a vehicle. It's so easily kills a vehicle, and it just catches everyone by surprise, the amount of output that come out of these units. So the great thing about that is that means that this particular combination, if you can squeeze out every last bit of damage from it, can deal with almost anything that's in front of it, be that really tough infantry units all the way up to kind of vehicles. So we are spoilt for damage here. There are even other ways of us getting damage from range, which kind of didn't exist in the index. So this is the area where I think we've probably improved the most. So we've got great trading piece damage with our Rubric squads with characters, which if we use them correctly, they're able to deal with problems for us really beautifully. But on top of that, we also now have very efficient and effective long range shooting options. The addition of a spell which can give you reroll hits on an enemy unit, suddenly opens up a lot of different things inside of the army. Now, I've got the Forge Fiend in the middle, which is my personal favorite vehicle. The maths on this is really great, into a pretty wide range of targets. But you also have other units like the Predator Annihilator here, or the Predator Destructor, which are actually quite efficient firing platforms. Um, Predator Annihilator, very interesting, is very efficient just as a solo piece, and the Predator Destructor makes great use of the buffs that we can apply to it. The unit which really stands out is probably the Zangor Enlighten on disc here with the bows. The bows have gone up to 5 -2, 2 damage. They're still at 30 inches of range, but they ignore cover and have lethal. So they've got a huge glow up here still with the 2 shots. The unit still has a reactive move, and it's priced to move at 80 points for 6. This unit with the rerolls to hit allows you to really do a lot of damage against all targets, including vehicles, but is brilliant against kind of Space Marine type models. And that just adds up across the game. So now not only do we have close range, high impact output, now we're not relying on Magnus to be our only source of long range output. We have other really effective long range output. That's kind of building the list for us now, because we have the back line, which does a load of output, and we have the middle slash forward line in our Rubric Marines and Sorcerers. So as long as you are buffing these units in the correct sequence, in the correct place, you can really squeeze out a lot of damage there. So I would, in terms of strategy, make sure that the rerolls to hit is targeted onto these 2 units over here, and I would make sure that this unit tries to get the increase in AP. That's usually how I try and focus my turn building when I'm planning out what I'm going to do for the turn. Cool. All right, let's go on to number 3 here, which is talking about how we're going to manage our resources. As an army, Thousand Suns, at the core of it, the most extreme output part of the army is the Rubric Marines and characters, which clock in, around the high 100, so kind of 180 points. They are quite expensive. When you use it as a trade piece, there's a good chance you are hitting things which are cheaper than it, and things which are more expensive you probably can't one tap with your Rubric Marines, but you can get pretty close. So that is an awkward trading piece that is also combined with that being relatively low durability. So you'll get removed very quickly here. In order to get around that, there are a few different approaches that we can take. Approach number 1 is to try and increase survivability inside of your army. So the Mutant Vortex beasts are brilliant, and if you take it in the Zangor detachment, the Mutant detachment, then you can have -1 to wound on this guy, which is absolutely obscene. They're priced at 160 points, so they are relatively cheap. If your terrain format allows you to run 3 of these guys very effectively, that is a good optimal choice, in my opinion. They are really nice for throwing out into the middle of the board and enticing your opponent to come deal with this with not a negligible amount of stuff. You have to deal with this with a significant amount of stuff. So, option number 1. Option number 2 is, let's say you're in the Rubric Phalanx and you want to run more Rubric Marines. The Exalted Sorcerer gives a 4-up invuln to the unit, can regen a model, which is kind of spicy when you're getting an extra point of armor save against damage 1. This 10-man unit with the Exalted Sorcerer can be really tanky here. You can also throw -1 damage onto them. And the regen can be used on the sorcerer, which allows the unit to shoot back at whatever's shooting it. So there's a lot of cool combos you can do in the Rubric Phalanx with a big unit of 10. There's also an argument for just running a big unit of 10. Uh, a really strong strategy in the missions that we have is just putting a model on the middle objective, just a single model, and being like, okay, what are you going to do about this? If you try and shoot this unit, you'll kill a few of them and they'll regen back onto the objective. If you come out onto the objective, great. Are you really, are you going to be charging into this area? How are you going to manage this? Whatever happens in that situation, your opponent is going to put significant resources in front of you if they want to properly deal with this unit, or they're giving up primary. So I like this. The other one is the Zangor Enlightened, which now can be attached with a disc character. So the Exalted Sorcerer on disc gives them an 18-inch loan up. So you could run these guys as your backfield on the sides, and they're able to trade into the opponent without actually trading. So they kill something in the opponent's army, and they're still able to stay safe. So this is also a really, really strong option. You can take multiples of these if you want. I've really enjoyed using this particular combination. Right. So, in terms of how we're kind of setting up and managing this particular unit, which is the Rubric Marines with a character attached to either the Infernal Master or the Sorcerer, is we really need to look at how we're sequencing and playing the game. Now, there's a concept which I think Thousand Sons do very well, but Eldar also do it very well, which is where you can leave the opponent with no good choices. Now, the way to ruin this approach is to be impatient. So, if you do set up your Rubric Marines, you measure and double check everything. You make sure that, if I disembark move, that's 9 inches. If I then temporal surge another 6 inches, I'm going to be able to get into this particular space. Very important you pre measure it, because what you don't want is to set up threat into nowhere. You don't want to be 15 inches, which ends you up in a position where you can't shoot anything behind a wall, you can't interact with the game. So it's critical. Rhino is in the correct place. You're expressing your threat. Um, so once you've done that, you need to consider how you're going to sequence this game. If you do have your Rhino and your threat set up in the right place, your opponent is very likely to be a little stuck on the options that they want to do. They will try and come forward, do something, but you'll always be able to engage and threaten them. It's very important at this point. If, let's say, you have 4 or 5 of these Rubric Marine squads, I found in my experience, if you throw all of them away at the same time and kind of kill the front line of the enemy's army, you'll find that your units die very quickly when they shoot back at them. So how I would usually sequence this is try and use these as a slow drip feed of Rubric Marine damage over the first 1 to 3 turns of the game. So you set up in position, you throw one Rubric Marine squad out, kill a few little elements, and then your additional output is going to come from your long range pieces that are threatening different lines and picking up extra stuff, rather than using multiple Rubric Marine squads. I think that sequence works very well. And the concept I was started off talking about is kind of like a little vice grip where, if you kind of just tighten it a little bit on the opponent at the start of the game and you think, okay, that's enough, I'm going to just win, let's send everything, then your opponent still has a bit of room where they can wriggle out of it. If your dice go really bad, something crazy happens, you make a little misplay in your positioning. But if you wait a couple of turns, tighten the vice grip a little bit more, your opponent might not be able to squeeze out of that situation no matter what you do. I've always preferred looking at the game over 3 to 5 turns rather than looking for the quick win over 1 turn, because the consistency and the reliability of doing that is much higher when you play it like that. Thousand Sons epitomize that concept really, really well. So I would recommend drip feeding your Rubric Marines and just using a long range output just to supplement your damage. At the very end of the game, you've got to use all your resources, so you can throw it away at that point. I go through this particular concept in my Eldari video, the 5 strategies to improve it, and I do that with a little bit of TTS. The concepts are very similar here. It's very much about not overcommitting and managing your fragile resources. You can use your tanky resources to force engagements, and you can use your long range output to supplement your damage so that you are killing enough of the opponent. The final thing is your screens. So this army, in order to deal with melee, this was a big missing part, because I played the Emperor's Children versus Thousand Sons game a few times and realized actually it's really hard to deal with the pressure here. But we do have pretty decent screens here. The 6-man units of Zangor Enlightened actually surprisingly make a really good screen. It's really easy to forget that they only cost 80 points. But actually, they're a brilliant unit to just string out in front of you. They're 6, so they can be strung out fully. And they can force your opponent to engage with a front line that they don't want to engage with, a very cheap unit. The 70 points, you can get 10 Zangor as well. These guys have Scout built in, and you can really give yourself one more turn where your opponent can't properly engage with you. This was a common tactic used in the Thousand Sons Index. It was a bit easier then, with kind of easier access to more movement, etc. But you can still achieve that, and I think it is absolutely critical. So if we try and build a game plan, in the early game, we want to try and put out tough things like a Mutilate Vortex Beast forward, force enemies to engage with you. Against things like melee pressure or things that want to move into certain places, like very vehicle-heavy armies, units like the 10 Zangor are very important to give a front line that your opponent can engage with, or against the vehicles to actually block them in and prevent some of their movement pathways. The 3-man units of Zangors are brilliant at that. You've then got your position set up with your rubrics behind walls, which can express threat on the enemy. And then you have little units of Zangor, perhaps, that can act as your primary denial pieces. OC6 is really nice on the 3-man units here. That is the kind of theory there. And then as the game goes on, you're drip feeding your rubric marines, setting up your firing lines with your long range shooting. And then eventually, when your opponent's diminished enough in resources, you're moving forward in turns 3 to 5 to finish off the game in a position where your opponent will try and attack you, but they really don't have enough stuff to do it properly. And then you can deal the killing blow. That's kind of the theory. I do kind of combine all of these factors into the list I'm taking to the Bristol Super Major. So if you want to know more information about that, it would be really handy, I think, for you guys to watch the deep dive video. Also, kind of handy as well if you're thinking of playing against these T-Suns. I think they are going to be a relatively popular army because they're quite cool. A lot of people want to try them. The aesthetic is pretty nice. So if you want to know more about that stuff, make sure you do check out the members only video, join the Discord, get involved with the discussion in whatever faction you play. And I would love to hear feedback on this if you find it interesting. Was it easy enough to follow? I feel like it was the concepts are much more complex than even the Eldari Yanari concepts, but I tried to simplify them as much as possible and give you guys kind of real world practical strategies that you can use in your game. I hope that was really interesting. This is Vik signing out. Thank you all for listening. And as always, I'll see you next time by the fireside. Thank you for listening to the 40K Fireside. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, drop us a comment, check out the YouTube members area, and we look forward to seeing you again next time by the fireside.